Today's webinar is the first in what will be a monthly series through the end of this academic year that will be offered as part of the work of Garrett's Indigenous Study Committee, which we'll hear more about shortly. So I'm Tim Eberhardt, Director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration at Garrett, which is aimed missionally at spreading regenerative theological understandings, earth-based religious practices, and cooperative solidarities for the just healing of both social and ecological relationships. If you'd like to receive communications from the center, you can sign up on the main webpage, which I believe has been shared in the chat. And you can also learn more about the launch of the center in our first newsletter, Field Notes. That link as well will be shared in the chat. And now I am very happy to introduce Dr. Kate Ott, Director of the STED Center.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Well, I should say good day. We never know where people are coming from in our meetings these times. So good day, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Eberhardt, for this collaborative opportunity, as well as Dr. Perdue for your co-leadership of the Indigenous Studies Committee. Reverend Dr. Woodley, we are grateful to you for your generous sharing of time and wisdom. I'm Dr. Ott, Director of the STED Center, where we seek to enhance at Garrett, the STED Center at Garrett, where we seek to enhance moral communities by addressing relevant critical justice issues, one conversation at a time. You can find out more about our work online at stedcenter.com. And we will share a follow-up written online article by Reverend Dr. Woodley in the weeks to come at that website as well. So please look for that. And I'd now like to invite Katie Fahey, the Garrett Admissions Officer, to share a welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ott and Dr. Eberhardt, for inviting me into this space, and thank you to our presenters for what they'll share here today. We are so excited to have you here today, and I know that this event is going to be transformative for you. And I'm simply here to share that if this event is exciting for you, if it leaves you with more questions than answers, and if you feel led to learn more, Garrett's here for you. Garrett offers a variety of options for learning, from enrichment courses all the way through doctoral degrees in a variety of modalities, from online to residential. If you get to the other side of today's event or this series of events and you want to continue exploring theological education, I would encourage you to reach out to us in the Office of Admissions at Garrett. Our team can help you discern what your next steps might be. You can reach out to us via email at getadmitted@garrett.edu or check out our website to learn more about our degree programs, scholarship opportunities, and admission deadlines. And there should be a link in the chat. Next, I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Stephanie Perdue, affiliate faculty at Garrett and co-chair with Dr. Eberhardt of the seminary's Indigenous Study Committee. Before turning to her, I'd like to call your attention to Dr. Perdue's recent article in the Christian Century on land acknowledgements, and you can see that in the chat. Dr. Perdue?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Dr. Eberhardt and Dr. Ott, for this opportunity to learn with Reverend Dr. Woodley, one of my Cherokee siblings. My citizenship is held in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And I am an affiliate professor in the area of history at Garrett, as well as an associate conference minister of the Illinois Conference United Church of Christ. Our seminary president convened our Indigenous Studies Committee last spring after the inauguration of Dr. Eberhardt in his new chair and after the opening of the Center for Ecological Regeneration. Recognizing that the center's first work would be a study of Garrett's past and present history and reality related to Native people and Indigenous land. So we have been charged by the president and the board of trustees to do a number of tasks, and we are well on our way to doing those, to research past and present realities of Garrett's impact on and relationship with the Native people of our bioregion, to highlight decolonial Indigenous theological perspectives, which we are doing today with our guest scholar, Reverend Dr. Woodley, to provide a truthful accounting of historical record, to consult with appropriate tribal, denominational, and institutional leaders, to explore potential future partnerships with Indigenous-led organizations and initiatives, and finally, to propose concrete recommendations to the seminary for potential reparative action. We will be bringing a full report to the Board of Trustees and the President this coming May, and then we'll propose that further action to them. So we are delighted to be embarking on this series of learning opportunities with you, and you can look for more information on upcoming opportunities on the Center for Ecological Regeneration website. We have a landing page there pertinent to the work of our committee, with the bios of our committee members and with information about our work. We have assembled an incredible cast of experts on our committee from within the United Methodist denomination, from other denominations with experience in doctrine of discovery, decolonial perspectives, or work with Native communities. We have students, alums, present faculty, and friends of the seminary involved in this work, and we are particularly thankful to our colleagues at the Center for Native and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University. Their Associate Director, Pamela Silas, sits on our committee, and they have been incredibly generous in sharing with us their research, which helps us round out our understanding of historical record. They have undertaken already some of that significant research. So please continue to look for opportunities to intersect with us in our work. We will continue to communicate with you, and we are so pleased to welcome Reverend Dr. Woodley. I believe Dr. Eberhardt will introduce him now.
Thank you, Dr. Perdue. Well, I could not be more excited to introduce Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, a farmer, an activist scholar, distinguished speaker, teacher, and wisdom keeper. He currently serves as Distinguished of Faith and Culture at Portland Seminary and Director of Intercultural and Indigenous Studies. Dr. Woodley was raised near Detroit, Michigan, and is a Cherokee descendant, recognized by the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, Huffington Post, and Christianity Today, among other places. And his work particularly addresses issues related to American culture, our relationship with the earth, and spirituality. He and his wife, Edith, are co-sustainers of Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Eloheh Farm and Seeds, a regenerative teaching center and farm in Yamhill, Oregon. Dr. Woodley has published many books and articles, but I'll mention just two of his more recent publications: Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, a decolonized approach to Christian doctrine, and Mission and the Cultural Other, a closer look. You can find a full list of his publications at randywoodley.com. Again, a reminder to participants today that Dr. Woodley will look forward to receiving and engaging your questions and comments at the end of his presentation, so feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. Dr. Woodley, thank you again so very much for accepting our invitation to share with us today and to contribute to the work of Garrett's Indigenous Study Committee.
Yes. Thank you. I guess everybody can hear me okay? There we go. Okay. If we have any problems with technical stuff, I may need some help, but you know, I'm an OG when it comes to technology. So yeah, a couple of things, preliminary comments, if I could, please. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this. I'm happy to be here, and really sort of like, as you said, this was the first. I'd like to give sort of a foundation to build on everything else if I there's something about the dangers that I should mention of theologizing from an Indigenous perspective. Theologizing is really a project of the Western world. It's not the same, especially among traditional people. When I have asked in the past traditional elders or even Christian elders, what are your beliefs? They will say things like that I treat my family well, that I don't cheat on my wife, that I'm not a drunk, that I give to my community and I'm generous. In other words, there's not gap between beliefs and what one does. And so I think that's one of the things that should be remembered throughout this presentation is that Native theology is a sort of almost an oxymoron, if you will. The other thing I'd like to mention is the fact that, you know, I didn't get to where I am by myself. The kinds of thoughts that I have are my thoughts. I'm not speaking for anyone else really but me, but I do want to recognize the fact that I've been fortunate to be given lots of information from many great elders along the way, and especially for my dialogue partners as we obtained our doctoral degrees, Dr. Richard Twist, Dr. Terry LeBlanc, Dr. Ray Aldred, and Adrian Jacobs. And so, you know, there were many years of us in dialogue about many of these things. And so I just want to acknowledge that, you know, this isn't just my work that I'm presenting. So, yeah, and I'll go ahead and get started. I have a PowerPoint presentation here, and let's see. I'm going to share screen, but it says one panelist share at a time. So in order to do that, somebody has to uncheck that and make me a co-host. Okay,
You are the host, so you should be able to.
Yeah, I checked multiples and that works now. Thank you. And let's see if I can get this thing going in the right place. Okay, now I got to back up. Okay, so this is all my materials, and if you want to contact me, do anything that's related to my work, or you know, questions that you have for me, whatever, my Instagram, Facebook, et cetera, that's all on this information page. Hopefully you will have all this recorded, and people will be able to go back and look at these things. So trying to lay a basic sort of foundation in our theology as Indigenous peoples, at least all that I've been exposed to, always begins with the land. I think it's important to keep that right up front. When we think about these kinds of things, the land is seen differently through Indigenous eyes, and it's seen as a relative. So colonization has no consciousness of specific place, right? Its universalizing tendencies make specific place all universalized space. So in other words, any land is all land. And that's a problem. And then problematizing indigenous peoples and universalizing that land has a de facto ward against theologies of place. And so it's no wonder that the West has had such weak theologies of place, although that's beginning to change now, which I'm happy about. Traditionally, indigenous people have understood themselves as communal, which includes the land and the whole community of creation as relatives. So we are in a reciprocal relationship, a symbiotic relationship with our relatives, and that is the whole community of creation. And then our theologies, which generally tend to be narrative, when we talk about the native theology, we want to talk about narrative theologies, are tied to a specific place via ceremony, song, sacred sites, dance, bones and spirits of our ancestors, or the graves of our ancestors, if you will. We've got to talk about decolonization and indigenization as two constructs that are interrelated. Decolonization, I define as simply to stop telling ourselves the ubiquitous lies of empire and colonial myths. Like layers of an onion, these take a while to peel back. And therefore, indigenization is the freedom to act on the new stories we can tell ourselves with our new consciousness. And I believe that one without the other is pretty futile. It's this idea that if you take something out, what are you going to fill it with, right? Process is extremely important. In order to begin this decolonial process from an indigenous perspective, I believe we have to begin to undermine the intellectual and theological premises of colonization and expose them. And this includes speaking truth to power. Secondly, work is done on the basis of the golden rule. In other words, what's the common good that's going to work for everyone? That's a good motivation for people to change. Thirdly, stop cooperating with colonialism and its pull toward inaction. Colonialism basically moves people who are especially oppressed towards inaction so they don't resist. And so we have to disrupt those colonial patterns. The biblical word for that, I think, is repent, which basically means everything that I was entangled in before that was a myth and lie and leading me the wrong direction, I have to reject, and I turn around and I entangle myself in the exact opposite. And so that would be true for colonization. Resist further injustice through a specific educational process from the cultural other, from people that take us out of our culture zone, or our comfort zone, from people of a different culture who would necessarily have things to say that we may not have thought about or thought about in the way that they think about them. So one of the things I like to say, especially in that's sort of what one of my newer books called Becoming Rooted is about. We're all indigenous from someplace. If we weren't, if our ancestors, regardless of where they're from, didn't learn how to live with a place in a particular way as a group, we wouldn't be here. And so regardless of where you're from, we all have indigenous roots. And the Western worldview and colonialism calls us to forget that. We're all human beings. This is that common good. Being human is the most spiritual experience I can have. I was created to be human. We all experience imbalance and fragmentation because we are human beings. And so we must rebalance ourselves and the world. And I'll talk more about this, how we get there, and use some Bible reference. The central process is reconnecting with the land. We all need to live a place-based existence, place-based theologies, have place-based contexts, living in harmony with the community of creation, or what the scriptures call shalom. I've attended the Pikavish, the Fixing the World ceremony in Northern California with indigenous Karuk there. And their job they take seriously every year, which is to fix the world. They sing, they dance, they have ceremony, and every year it's a world renewal ceremony, and it's beautiful. They take their role seriously as Indigenous people. And many of our tribes do this in various ceremonies, but this is the most outright rebalancing of the world ceremony that I've ever attended. It's our worldviews that create our theologies, not vice versa. We tend to think that, oh, because I believe this about God, I think this way about the world, but it's actually different, as most anthropologists would tell us. And harmony, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, harmony is about not just our individual selves, but also our social selves, our ecological selves. Those are all fixing the world. Those are all fulfilling our role as human beings on Earth, whether it's sex slave trafficking, or stopping pollution being dumped in a river, or working on my water system, ecological things, or anti-racism work. It's all fixing the world. And so we tend to compartmentalize those in the West, but they're all part of what it means to be human. This is just a quick, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to go just through a couple of specific ones that are most important, I think, for this presentation. I think I've compared apples to apples here and talking about a Western worldview and a more Indigenous worldview, and noting that there are different Western worldviews and different Indigenous worldviews, but basically I'm talking about the ones that have traveled with empire, and the ones that for Native theology, the worldviews that were very much intact, and the things we had in common as traditional people. So let's look at a couple of those. Dualism, or Platonic dualism, is the foundational fallacy, I think, to all of these. Begins with Plato. It's given down through Aristotle. Aristotle creates some hierarchical forms of dualism, passes on through Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great creates Hellenism throughout the known world at that time. It starts to die out, and we have this thing between the 13th and 17th centuries called the Renaissance, which is the revitalization of Greek thinking, Greek authors, philosophers, architecture, art, et cetera, and then it births two twins that come to America, and one is the philosophy known as the Enlightenment. The other is the religious sort of side of that, which is called the Reformation. And both, I would argue, doubled down on Platonic dualism. What does it do? It divides reality. It invests in the ethereal, the mental, spiritual, metaphysical, abstract realm to the higher degree than the physical. Our thoughts, our philosophies, our theologies become disembodied in that process, because the mind and those abstract things are more important than the physical, our bodies, the earth, the land, the good works that we do. Our bodies all become suspect. And you can begin to think about how these have played out in theologies. The products of the mind, laws, documents, doctrines, rules, things that are written down, especially, are held in a higher degree than personhood and community. This leads to binary thinking, where things are always right or wrong, legal, illegal, or illegal, heaven, hell, success, failure, civilized, primitive, introvert, extrovert, good and bad, saved or lost, clean or dirty, weeds or plants, which most of the weeds that we have on our farm are medicines, animals or varmints. All of this makes it difficult for Western thinkers to take two things that seem incompatible and to try and make them work together. That holding the tension is a difficult process for Western thinkers, and it creates false assumptions that all the things are of the mind, and maybe once they're understood, they can be solved, which I think takes a lot of hubris. But so we'll look at shalom, which is the biblical word for the kinds of harmony that we're talking about. It's not ethereal. It's very much embodied throughout all of Scripture. And that it's embodied not just in how we treat our individual communities, but our structures and what I call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct. They're very tangible things that are done, like not gleaning the edges of the field, setting aside 1/7 of your land, et cetera, for not just human beings who need it, but also for the animals who need it. So Shalom is about now. I think disembodied theologies with a heaven that's more important to us later is not at all what the Scriptures teach. Redbird Smith, one of our traditional Keetoowah leaders, said, "This religion does not teach me to concern myself of the life that shall be after this, but it does teach me to be concerned of what my everyday life shall be." And that always reminded me of where Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today is enough for today. Today's troubles is enough for today." Also, this dualism has created individualism, the loss of the corporate nature of humanity and community, to interpret the Scriptures as for me. But they were not written by, for, or towards individualistic worldviews. It creates competitiveness over cooperation, majority rule over consensus, which I never thought, and we can just look at our elections that just occurred. 51% just leaves 49% dissatisfied and maybe not willing to work. Greed. I think an indigenous and in a shalom-based scriptural worldview, all of creation is healed. It's equated with our ideas of restoration and balance and harmony for all creation, not just humanities. For humanity, human beings are the only creatures who just decide that they're going to reject their purpose. And so let's talk about what that purpose is. Hierarchy, everything becomes ranked as greater and lesser. Equality is maybe not seen always as wrong, but it's at least not the preferred system. So these structures have created dehumanization by class, race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, religion, etc. So I like this verse of Jesus where he says, "You know the rules. Rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant." And we like to take that last verse and say, "Oh, well, this should be our personal ethic." But we forget that he starts off talking about a structural ethic as well, structural justice and structural hierarchy. And that's the context. And he says it shouldn't be so among you. Human beings then should not be superior to nor subordinate to creation. And I want to point out that it's not just Christians that believe this, that human beings are sort of the pinnacle of creation. Buddhists, Hindus, evolutionists, they all espouse ideas that purport to imply human beings are at the pinnacle of created, reincarnated, or evolutionary order. Indigenous creation narratives invariably reveal human beings as a cooperative partner with the rest of creation, participating with creation in an important role, usually as caretakers or what I call co-sustainers. Even the many indigenous creation narratives absent of human beings remind us that creation can exist without us. Superficial compartmentalization is another malady of the Western worldview. It's important that we understand all these before we really get into what indigenous theology is. Reductionism divides erroneously and classifies life into many parts without attention to the whole, creates unrelated categories that are partial reality, and then it tries to live out of those partial realities. There are lots of examples of that, but the one theological example is the idea of salvation or healing that's for our souls and not for everything. And then utopianism, which is shared and is Christianity is very much based on a utopian vision, Western Christianity at least, living for another world or the future or the past. Now let's get back to the book of Acts, sort of thing. which often negates our humanity, our human frailty, and seeks perfection. And usually it means that the ends of the other world, whether it's past or future, justify any means in this world, often ending tragically. White supremacy is part and parcel of that. It's had a long path. The white supremacy I define as white, light-skinned, Western European descent people have the inherent right to control all governance, knowledge, wealth, and power in any given system. It's a system of what I call otherism. Greeks had their barbarians, Romans are savages, English heathen. Americans have lots of folks as the cultural, racial, genderized other. It creates an intolerance for difference, and laws of the other systems and laws are formed to maintain those systems. Modern expressions of white normalcy and white privilege are derived from ancient Greece, Rome, Anglo-Saxonism, etc. In just some of the ways that that's been expressed in America, Greek fatalism, which often is in the form of Calvinistic fatalism and destiny. But it needn't be pure Calvinism. We have enough of it in most of our theologies, regardless. Expanding empire, doctrine of discovery, Calvinistic Puritanism, manifest destiny, millennial utopianism, Americanization, more currently American exceptionalism, and MAGA. So our worldviews create worlds. We make sense of our world using faith and theology. Theology asks and answers, who is God and what is my purpose? Faith is how we live into the myth that our theology gives us. Christian theology, I would argue, should start with the cosmic Christ. Jesus, the cosmic creator, inhabits local, place, time, and so should we. Jesus was eventually recognized by many of the writers of the New Testament as creator. The efficacy of Christ in creation as creator, the fact that God has always had covenantal relationship with all peoples, the fact that Jesus' life embodied truth, meaning all truth points to him and he fulfills all truth, points to the inescapable reality that Jesus is everywhere present and formulating relationships with all people. And there's plenty of scriptures here for us to look at. So let's start with, if we're going to look deep into this, let's start with the creation stories. And we have our own, this would take too long to tell, but one Cherokee creation story is about Shelu and Kanati, who are the first human beings. They're made to be earth keepers. Harmony is eventually broken by someone called Wild Boy. I won't tell you how all that happens, but Wild Boy convinces his brother, which is their son, to break harmony, to commit murder, to make all kinds of things. So it's harder to hunt, harder to grow. Eventually, in the story, very long story, the family eventually reunites and harmony is restored after the lessons are learned. So Genesis, I find the first few chapters of Genesis very similar, lots of common themes. Immediately after their creation, first man and first woman are given responsibility in the garden as partners with Creator in creation care. They become co-sustainers with Creator and the rest of the community of creation. Part of the rationale is so that they become fruitful and multiply. As everything will become fruitful and multiply as the story goes. First man and first woman are commanded to work, to serve, to till. As co-sustainers, humans are to work with the earth so that the physical creation prospers and is fruitful. They're told to watch, to guard, to preserve good creation, Tov Meod. As co-sustainers, humanity keeps watch over, guards, and protects their entrusted earth. Violation or abuse of this shalom responsibility ultimately will threaten all creation. God saw everything that God had made, and it was good. Eventually, the story goes, everything ends in harmony. Talk about this word to rule or co-sustain, which has been taken out of its context through most of Western theology. And a couple thoughts here, just in the same verse, the fact that we are made in the image of God is linked to our call to exercise radah, or dominion, or to tread down. As God's representatives figure, our radah is to bear the likeness of God's radah, not the kind of rule that serves the self at the expense of others. So dominion is maybe not what we have thought it is, not the kind of rule that exploits its subjects or their resources. God's rule is characterized by emphatic love. The Creator blesses, provides for, and protects the well-being of every relationship, every creature, and every domain in creation. And those relationships are characterized by love, truth, reciprocity, servanthood, faithfulness, and humility. The relationships between humanity, vegetation, and animals are all declared very good under God's care. They are practicing and experiencing God's shalom. Quoting Lisa Sharon Harper here. But when we fail to exercise God's kind of dominion, when we rule for our own benefit, when we exploit other humans, when we plunder and pillage the rest of God's creation, sucking the earth's veins dry, then shalom is shattered. And creation stands as a witness, testifying with a loud voice, you are separate from God. Your relationship with the rest of creation is broken. Your relationship with the rest of humanity is plundered. We are co-sustainers with the whole community of creation. Our role as human beings in creation is to maintain harmony and balance of the whole community of creation, both in our Cherokee understanding and many other tribal understandings, and also in the Genesis story. We have the privilege of co-sustaining all of creation with Creator and the earth and all creatures contributing. Our Cherokee word to describe this is Eloheh. The Bible uses shalom. Many of our tribes have many different words. In the Genesis story, human beings are created last, not to rule, but to fill the need to co-sustain, not as the crown of glory, but as the only creatures uniquely equipped to co-sustain the rest of creation. It's a responsibility, not a privilege, not over the land, but serving and preserving God's creation. To be a co-sustainer in the community of creation is foundationally what it means to be human. Say that one more time. To be a co-sustainer in the community of creation is foundationally what it means to be human. The healing narrative, Genesis 1-3, creation is harmonious and balanced. Original sin, as I understand it, is the misuse of land as God intended, the misuse of a particular tree and the rest of the land. Disharmony occurs, which is through ecocide. It leads to broken relationships, blame, marginalization, and subjugation, and eventually ethnocide. In Jesus, harmony is restored with the whole community of creation, individually and structurally. Creation exists for Creator. It's simply our happiness is a byproduct of responsible and co-sustaining of creation. To willfully ignore the damage being done to creation is degrading. To benefit from creation's destruction is disrespectful. To take pleasure in its damage is sadistic. Our obedience to our faith, our human purpose, and our legacy to future generations is to co-sustain creation. So what's happened in the West is what we call a replacement theology. Indigenous worldviews offer an alternative to the theological perspective that may be missing among current scholarship. Gospel accounts, as seen through the lens of an indigenous worldview, help us to understand why it is critical to view the Christ who created the world and everything in it in a local, praxis-oriented construct of place. The historic Jesus looks different through a harmony, shalom-based, local, indigenous, place-based theological lens. The indigenous focus on Jesus' relationship to creation, which is all there. I mean, there's lots of modern inventions, and the Romans had done all kinds of things, aqueducts and crossbows and chariots, and there's all kinds of stuff going on in this big city, Jerusalem, that didn't seem to impress him that much. Instead, he spent 40 days out in the wilderness. He ends up going away when people crowd him too much, especially in the book of Mark. He talks about flowers. He talks about birds. He talks about seeds. He talks about soil. These are the things that impressed Jesus. His incarnation, his life, his crucifixion, and his resurrection is different than modern Christian views that consistently produce a redemption-based replacement theology and a replacement missiology that has destroyed and continues to destroy many indigenous cultures. An indigenous viewpoint has direct implications for how we live our lives, how we understand our salvation and healing, and how we go about doing mission. Quoting Christopher Budden from Australia, without an honest beginning among Western theologians, unrighteous invasion will continue to be fitted into the European worldview and theology as normal, and racism will continue to include white privilege and white normalcy. The way forward is both structural and relational, requiring theological thought. Excellent book if you haven't read it, Following Jesus in Invaded Space. And I want to talk about what's happening in the world a bit because it's very much related. We call it the Anthropocene. I like to call it the Europatricene. It was the European elite that developed a distinctively mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, and an economic system indebted to geographical expansion. The resulting political orders measured success by how much wealth could be generated in the exploitation of peoples and resources. The geological record bears the mark of this European assemblage of hierarchies. Understanding the forces of Europeanization, the forces of racial superiority, economic hegemony, and global resettlement is essential to understanding how the planet got to this point. Cherokee Grove. And who gets to judge these things? Well, we are all sort of swimming in our own bubbles, but I would say that there's plenty of sort of places we can go to in Scripture that could lead us. And basically, it's always those who are pressed most, who are the ones, when it comes to justice, who get to say what justice is. And so here's some examples that you can see with David and the Gibeonites. In Job, Job ends up being the person, the sin, which I would say is very reminiscent of the sin of Western missions and the Western church in America, which is misrepresenting God. God says, go to Job, and if he'll pray for you, I'll forgive you. In the book of Acts, we see it by choosing the Greek deacons to make sure justice is done. And just to kind of keep us on our toes, a modern comedian and philosopher, D.L. Hughley, said, white people can't judge what is racist any more than the Pope can judge what is pedophilia. Ouch. So there's also a relationship between the land and an extraction mentality and how people are treated. In the Western worldview, the nature of the relationship with the land has changed over time. It's become extractive, taking more than our share. That worldview has also embedded itself in the Western church. Some goals leading to the crisis are short-term thinking, global corporate advancement, and American value of convenience, all resulting from a deranged Western worldview. And I say there's a corollary between how European Americans treat creation, classically, and how they've treated people, especially women and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, to control, to objectify, to expect production from, to exploit, to serve at one's pleasure, a veritable rape culture. Thus, we're experiencing an earth crisis, patriarchy, and racism altogether. Not the Anthropocene, with the Europatricine. Topsoil's disappearing, forests are shrinking, desertification is advancing, coral reefs are dying, plants, fish, birds, animals, insects are all going extinct. Indigenous people have lived here for at least 28,000 years. Now we're beginning to understand this, possibly talking about now 100 or hundreds of thousands of years, without permanently endangering the land. It's something that had to be learned over time. 530 years of the Western worldview in America has not done the earth nor the world much good. It's been a failed experiment. And I'd like to introduce a concept of chaos and adaptation that are, I believe, part of an indigenous theological worldview and often missing from a Western Enlightenment worldview. In a Western Enlightenment worldview, human beings can be categorized apart from nature, resulting in a false dichotomy between the physical earth and spiritual beings, the material world and spiritual people. In a harmony worldview, which I would also say is a biblical shalom worldview, human beings are understood as fully physical and the earth is fully spiritual. Healing then considers everything and our histories, including colonialism and neocolonialism and all of creation. Jesus understood it all as sacred. He said, don't say by heaven, because heaven's God's throne. Don't say by earth, because earth is his footstool. It's all sacred. There's a problem with worldview, not theology, worldview, when we consider one sacred and not the other. So many of us have what we consider to be a theological problem we're trying to fix, and what we're really trying to fix is a worldview problem. Humanity is meant to be in direct relationship with all creation. Love this verse. Ask the animals, they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and let the fish of the sea inform you. Chief Siddle. Humankind is not woven the web of life, but we are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound, all things connect. And here's a glimpse of what I would call a one-stranded web, built on the premise of homogeneity. But God's world is built on the premise of unity and diversity. From the subatomic all the way down to quarks. If you know what quarks are, they're never alone within an atom. All the way up to the macro multiverse. God's DNA on the world in all of nature is unity and diversity. And God builds differently than we build. We sort of build like this. And we think that's order. And we think that's stable. But this is actually what's falling apart, is our order. Nature's chaos is actually stable. Why? Because nature continues to adapt. Adaptation is what is stable. God built in open systems. They contain both unity and diversity in their nature. Homogeneous closed systems are actually built to die. And we can go with lots of examples of that. The nature of a closed system is to consume itself or be consumed by other more adaptive systems. The nature of open systems is to adapt and not fight against entropy. Our future is in adaptation, and this is something Indigenous people understand. Order is the reality of planning and perseverance with adaptive, sustainable systems. Order works with entropy, not against it, building open, adaptable systems of unity and diversity. Chaos occurs by attempting to fight entropy through unsustainable, closed, non-adaptive systems. It's insane. It's what the Western worldview is built on, stability or false stability. Climate change, zoonosis, including COVID and lots of other diseases, are a result of the Western world's rejection of creators and creation's natural laws of harmony and balance, and mostly to do with development. Nature adapts to survive. Unfortunately, under the present circumstances, the final adaptation of nature is human extinction. We only have a short time to come back from our own unsustainable chaos and back to Creator's sustainable order. This has all been obvious to Indigenous people. I've learned so much by listening to traditional people and their worldviews and how they look at the West. But the West feels that they will be protected for some reason from all of the things that are going on, all the problems in our world. This false hope is not built on truth, but age-old philosophical ideas handed down from Greece, Rome, England, and other Western nation states. An Indigenous biblical shalom, harmonious worldview is different than this. God's concern is also about restoring the common good, structurally, actively, and passively in shalom. Creator's love is abundant, including peace, mercy, justice, hospitality, righteousness, restitution, and a whole plethora of characteristics and expressions for the common good, and for which the byproduct is also good for individuals. Shalom is the ethic Jesus preached and the action he lived as he confronted systems of broken shalom in a fragmented world. If we could just let it sink deep into our theologies that Jesus' constant reference to the kingdom was that of a shalom kingdom. That shalom kingdom is not ethereal or utopian in nature. It's very real. Shalom can be clearly identified, and it is communal in nature, not being satisfied just to seek the good of the individual. Shalom seeks the common good, and it benefits the whole community in identifiable and tangible ways. I say our spirituality or our humanness is best demonstrated through vulnerability. And I ask this question: could it be that God is the most vulnerable being who exists? If God is love and love means being vulnerable, then God must represent the essence of vulnerability. The incarnation of Jesus expressed great mysteries, vulnerability. Jesus' lifestyle of hanging out with the poor and marginalized expressed Creator's vulnerability. The crucifixion demonstrated God's vulnerability. Jesus sharing Creator's mission with us and leaving the responsibility in our hands to co-act with God by structuring love as shalom is a radical expression of the most vulnerable Creator God. In Jesus, we are invited to become fellow human beings with others who are different from us, to exchange and empower dignity in ourselves and others, to join in reciprocal conversion of each other's understanding of truth, and to live with, for, and among the community of creation, including people, in shalom. The opposite of vulnerability is control. The opposite of vulnerability is the illegitimate use of power. The opposite of vulnerability is the misuse of power, which is the primary failure of Western colonizer Christianity. So what we need are renewed relationships, restitution and reparations, massive education among white people by non-Western thinkers, problematizing the real problems, and partnerships. I'm giving some examples here of some structural change just so that we have a tendency to think of all these things as individual, what must I do? But these things are also structure. And so I list a number of areas here that can be done, but the fastest way, the fastest path to, I think, trying to restore the earth in harmony is to support efforts toward what we call the earth rights or rights of Mother Earth. And there's a number of organizations here that I recommend that do that. If you're just going to choose one, I would recommend the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Their website will give you the most information, probably. Food and everything else in our whole community of creation is our relative. When Ono Duke says food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. That's how we consider food. Food has a culture. It has a history. It has a story. It has relationships. And that's one way that we can think about what we all do daily, which is eat. What is the relationship to the food that we eat? For decolonization to happen, it follows that the antidote to the problem will be found in decolonization. To be consciously anti-genocidal, one must be actively anti-imperialist and vice versa. To be in any way an apologist for colonialism is to be an active proponent for genocide. For Americans of European descent, embracing such a project will require a unique process of healing. In the process of healing the wounds left by the sins of our fathers on the backs of indigenous peoples across the planet, we must simultaneously heal our own wounded spirits. Left unhealed, these wounds condemn us to perpetuate those same sins generation after generation. Deconstruction is an awfully messy process, no doubt. And now that comfortability has become one of the main values in America, it's especially uncomfortable. But high risk, high rewards, validation, partnership, trust, relief, empowerment, friendship, humility, security, confidence, interdependence, and I would just say a better world, better community, and a better us. One of the Shoshone elders said, "Don't begrudge the white man his presence on this land. He doesn't know it yet. He's come here to learn from us." And we pray that that be the case. Just a little bit reading. If you haven't read some of these books, these are some of the books that have influenced me. And I would recommend them. And now I'm happy to have a chance to do some dialogue.
Dr. Woodley, thank you so much for all that you have shared and guided us through so carefully. Let me invite my colleague, Dr. Perdue, if she has a follow-up question to get us started. And then I know we will have questions in the Q&A that participants have been adding.
Sure. I think this is a question that really could pertain to anyone in the audience. And so maybe it's a way to open up the conversation a little expansively. Dr. Woodley, when you opened, you noted that theology, really at its best or most grounded, no pun intended, is land-based. And that much of Western, at least Western Christendom, influenced by a colonial mindset, goes exploring and loses rootedness with that land and kind of perpetuates itself far from that sense of there being any particular rootedness with any land. And I'm thinking about you and your heritage. I'm thinking about me. I'm thinking about as Cherokees, the legacy of removal, which for both your nation and mine took our ancestors from the Smoky Mountain region and the rootedness in that bioregion to northeastern Oklahoma. And now you're in Oregon, and I'm not in northeastern Oklahoma. And, many of us live far from that rootedness of our ancestors for various reasons. I mean, for those who are native, often because of removal, allotment, urban relocation, but for others in this nation and in the Garrett community, because of traveling to seek education or, in whatever ways our people have relocated. And so I'm wondering if you have any wisdom or insight for us in terms of reconnecting with the land that we are presently on.
Yeah.
Even if it isn't the place of our ancestors. Whether it's the result of voluntary movement, immigration, or colonization.
Yep. It's a great question, and one that I receive a lot over the years. I have, and when I actually tried to answer through this book, which was published in January this year, Becoming Rooted: 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth, and it's 100 meditations and action points that you can do to reconnect with the land and your own indigeneity. But the fact that people come from Europe and other places, Africa and other places, and they live here permanently, the fact that many Cherokee people were removed. Most of my ancestors were actually old settlers who who chose to move out, but same thing. I am right now, both my wife and I, my wife is Eastern Shoshone. Her people were originally in Central Oregon. We're now in Western Oregon on the land of the Kalapuyan people. And we are not the host people of this particular land. And yet, when we went to the host people of this particular land and we asked, what can we do to honor you and your ancestors and Creator and this land, their first concern was how we took care of the land. And so, again, we can't separate ourselves from the land. So what we can do is to be a co-sustainer in the best ways that we can, and hopefully with their advice. And so I always tell people, connect with the host people of your own land, find out what they're doing, read their histories, read their stories, attend their ceremonies if you can, attend their powwows and other cultural events, learn what they're involved in politically. Most of it, probably 99% of it, has to do with something to do with saving the land and helping the land and healing the land. So I think there's ways that we do that, but I think we can also bring our own indigeneity into it. So I asked permission because I have Cherokee ceremonies that I've been given. And so I went to their cultural people and I said, is it okay with you that I practice my cultural ceremonies on your land? And they said, absolutely. You have our permission. Just don't try to do our stuff. And I'm like, no, I would never do that. Right. So I think there's ways to be a good guest on someone else's land and tap into your own indigeneity, despite the fact that you are not in the land of all of your ancestors. And that's just, I think, it's part of sort of the human journey, but it's especially part of the intentional colonial journey to displace us from our lands.
Thank you. I'll see if Dr. Eberhardt has a question, and I know we have a growing number of questions that Dr. Ott is fielding over in the Q&A space.
I do have a question, but I want to honor our participants. So I'm going to turn to some of these questions I'm seeing. An expression of thanks, Dr. Woodley, and then a question. In mission and the cultural other, you distinguish between redemption-based and creation-based theology. Could you please expand on the difference? And in doing so, can Indigenous persons abandon redemption-based theologies?
Yes. And yes, redemption-based theologies are come out of a sort of replacement mentality that we have to redeem something that God has already called good, that we have to sort of like capture it for Christ or capture it for whoever we're trying to capture it for, and make it good again. And the idea of the cosmic Christ as creator, or at least the efficacy of creation, really bites against that, because not only is Christ the creator, but the one who is with us, the one who has came and lived this life for us, who's had this relationship as a human being, shows us how to be the best human beings possible. And so we look at it and we go, well, it's a good earth, it's a good ceremony, it's a good whatever it is that we're trying to redeem, and make it something other than what it has been. So this is a little bit flies in the face of what we've been taught in mission as contextualization. So cultural contextualization says, like, I get there and I look and I find out like what these the kind of cultural things of this culture that I'm with, what is sort of defendable through scripture, that can be, and so that's a redemptive approach. what I would call a restorative approach, or the approach. What was the language that a creation-based approach? Is that I look and I say, God is already active here. God has been doing things. Truth has been spoken here. I need to simply join in the truth that has already been given. Now, I may have my different beliefs about how Jesus fulfills that truth or whatever, and that's okay, to have different beliefs and to discuss those, and etc. But I take the word seriously. Tov meod. All of creation is very, very good, and it hasn't been denounced otherwise. The only reason that we think that is because Augustine was an empire theologian, and he created this thing where it gave the Catholic Church all the power by saying that we're sinful by birth and that we have to be redeemed and the earth has to be redeemed. That's not at all what I get out of the story. So two totally different approaches.
Dr. Woodley, here's a participant with a question, and I think this came in your slides where you were talking a little bit about the kind of the views of missionaries encountering our nations, and you, I think, used the word or a term replacement theology, and so the participant is asking, can you say more about this idea of replacement? Is it the same as supersessionism?
Yeah, a little bit. So he can make his own comparisons with supersessionism. So let me just give you a very good example. One Christian goes in, native Christian, goes in and says, oh, okay, so I can use my cultural context and glorify God through Jesus. So I make up a bunch of songs on the drum that are very, what I would call Jesus-y. So now I've sort of replaced what was not quite as good with what is better, okay, in that person's opinion. And that's basically the modern contextual movement. Or I can listen to the song and understand that God was present in the revelation of the song, that God was present in the creation of the song and everything else, and say, that's good enough. I don't have to. Maybe I might, be inspired to do that, but it's not necessary. What God has given our people is already good. Now, that's not true for everything, right? In any culture, every culture has its, sort of good and bad that we have to wade through. But by and large, cultural contextual Christianity, which, I'm credited as being one of the sort of creators of this modern movement, has just settled with a replacement theology instead of saying what God has given is good. What our people, our songs, our dances, our ceremonies, those are spiritual, godly, and I can use those for me and for my community. Does that example help at all?
It does. Let me turn to another question here. This one from a pastor in Texas whose congregation is doing work on decolonizing worldviews and centering Indigenous voices, who shares how much they are learning, how much their worldview and spirituality is shifting in the process, building relationships with local elders. And then the question, I guess I'm wondering, what keeps you connected to Jesus and or Christianity, and is it worth it? Is there hope in the church, or have we done too much damage?
Well, yes, too much damage has been done. But for me, so I was at 10 years old, native church camp, a full-blood Ojibwe guy led me to Christ, and sort of wandered away from that. And my personal experience was pretty raunchy. By 19, I was strung out on drugs and pretty messed up. And it came a point in my life where I was by myself and alone, and I prayed to Jesus, because I'd had that experience as a 10-year-old boy. And my prayer was, and everybody has their own stuff. And I realize, of course, this doesn't happen for everybody. This is not sort of the formula. But for me, what happened was I said, Jesus, if you're real, deliver me from these drugs and I'll serve you the rest of my life and I'll never look back. And the next thing I know, I woke up from being asleep on the floor. I don't know. I think I thought I got kicked by a mule or something. And I had no desire to do drugs again. And I understood that the Jesus I knew as a child, and that the Jesus I read about in the scriptures, and that the Jesus I continued to pray to and have a relationship, was the one who was both, to me, the ultimate and the intimate, the one who satisfied my search for who God is and what my purpose is. And so I've not abandoned him, and he's not abandoned me, and I guess it'll be that way. And that's what connects me. Other people have different experiences. Other people pray different prayers. Other people do different things. But for me, and I'm not connected necessarily to Christianity. I think Western Christianity is too far gone. And so I always say that you can be a Christian and follow Jesus, but it's really difficult. For us, we just consider ourselves native people who use our traditions and follow Jesus. So.
Another question here related to part of what you had shared under what is needed was massive education among white people by non-Western thinkers, and the naming of reparations, concrete, material, economic, etc. reparations. And the questioner says, as an African-American woman, I'm wondering what else is needed in Black and other marginalized communities that I have suffered such harm and have adapted, in some cases, harmful theologies. Any thoughts?
I think a lot of communities, especially oppressed, and I'm leaving basically white Americans out of this for right now, just because that we've all been exposed to so much white theology that I don't need to focus on that. But there are good things in that as well. But all peoples, there's all kinds of course, Black theologies of liberation and womanism and all kinds of things that I can learn from. I attended from a group, a men's group, for a long time. Me and my friend Richard Twist in Portland here, and it was about mostly Black and white folks, and we were sort of a couple of the cultural others. But I remember Richard one time said, I'm so glad I've been in this group, because I would never understood a God who is Black, and vice versa. We all sort of have things to learn from one another. We're all resisting, even among our native people as well. We're subject to colonial patterns, colonial thinking. It's ubiquitous, and so we're all on this journey together to learn from one another. And so Indigenous voices aren't the only ones that the sort of people who have been dominating these worlds of theology and colonialism have to learn from. They need to learn from everyone. And so it's no competition. It's a matter of we all have something to teach one another. I have a friend who says, we're not in the oppression Olympics. We're not trying to, decide who has it the worst and then they get, first. No, it doesn't have to be that way. But it would be nice if Native people are remembered more often than we are. Usually we're not mentioned, or we're the last ones mentioned. And as if, and when we are mentioned, it's sort of like they're the project rather than we are the people that actually can empower other people by our history and our knowledge and our wisdom.
Thank you. There's a question here about how non-Native communities can work toward being in relationship with Native nations in ways that acknowledge the harm caused by genocide and colonialism without, I think, culturally appropriating or appropriating and re-traumatizing or taking parts that work. I think that means taking things from a kind of an indigenous Native worldview and discarding the rest, which in other words, I think would be a continuing kind of objectification and extractive process.
Right. Yeah, and that's an important question. There are some Native folks who, and Black folks and other folks who are tired of having to educate white people, right? It's sort of like, you know, and then once you decide that you might want to help, it's sort of like they expect you to do it for free often. And so, I mean, I get those emails at least once a month. And it's sort of like, now we've just found out this truth that you've been talking about for 30 years, and we want you to educate us. And that can get tiring. But we're not all called to do it, but if we don't do it, who's going to do it? So I had an elder say to me one time when we were, my wife and I were sort of lead catalysts at a Native gathering for a few days, and it just didn't, they just didn't do a good job with it, you know. And so and an elder told me, you guys have got to do what you do on your land and bring people there so that they can experience Native people and culture without sort of all the white trappings. And so because pedagogy is I think often more important than content. It's how the process happens and what we do, and how sort of the movement goes throughout those times. And so yeah, some of us are called to do that, and there are seasons when we get tired, and you know, I think for people to be sensitive to that, first of all, to form relationships. I think even before relationships can be formed, often there has to be a sort of a servant attitude, or a willingness to be vulnerable. So I tell people, people contact me and say, hey, how do I find out more about Kelpooians? I say, well, first go to their website, you know, look at their culture pages, look at what they're doing. What are their resources? What are they telling you about themselves? What are their events? Are you attending them? You know, are you saying, hey, you know, hey, I see you're having a powwow. You know, do you need cleanup afterwards? I could be there and I could help clean up and stuff like that. I say, you know, after 3 or 4 times, somebody's going to ask you, hey, what? I've seen you around here before. What are you doing here? You know, relationships are something that's real. There's not a formula for them. You sort of have to navigate them on your own. And but I think it's always best to start connecting with the host people of the land that you're on through ways that you know, in cultural appropriation, since that was mentioned, what we want is people who will not appropriate the cultures, but appropriate the values that have been developed on the land after thousands of years, because those are the ones that sustain us. So again, when I ask the right person, you know, about the land that I'm on, her first concern was about the land itself, you know. And so, yeah, am I valuing it the way that her people have valued it in the past, and that the way that they value it now? Am I objectifying it, or am I actually building a relationship with it? And yeah, it's been a learning process, and it is for all of us.
Thank you. And I would just point everyone in this learning session back to our Garrett Indigenous Study Committee website, where not presently, but in the future, we will be sharing with you some links to area Native communities. There are a lot of pan-Native communities here in the Chicago area that you can follow and get involved with. Center for Native and American Research at Northwestern right now is having 30 days of Indigenous activities. So you can find out about those things to kind of capitalize, I think, on what Dr. Woodley was saying. Get to know the Native people in your own area, get to know those communities, find out who they are, and find out, as you're saying, I think, are there some invitational, humble ways that you can approach and get to know those folks?
And lots of listening.
Dr. Woodley, we're coming close to time. I'll ask a question for myself here, somewhat related to the work of the committee here at the seminary. In thinking about, and I know this is part of what you'll be writing and sharing as a short written piece that will be on the Stead Center's webpage. But in thinking about the role of theological education, particularly Western dominant forms of theological education that have emerged from, justified, framed, in many, if not most cases, the colonial project. In thinking about and aspiring and working toward theologies, spiritualities, forms of discipleship, forms of eco-justice, forms of formation and education that are deeply rooted in place, that are deeply tied to the rhythms, the needs of the land, of the more than human kin, our family, our siblings all around. How might, or what do you envision when you think about a seminary, a faith-based college or university or other forms of higher education? What does theological education look like that's deeply place-based, land-based in this liberative Indigenous perspective that you're offering to us?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of experience with what you're talking about. So as one of the co-founders of NAITS, North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, we pondered that question for a long time and tried to create a hybrid sort of situation that was largely Indigenous professors, largely Indigenous content. I've come to the place, though, where I don't believe it can be done without Indigenous pedagogy. And I think that's actually the most important part of this. And so I'm not sure that institutions are prepared to do this, to sort of redirect their thinking into one, putting Indigenous people in charge of some sort of a program like that and doing it in an Indigenous way. What they may be ready for is to take places like Eloheh, where we do Indigenous teaching and learning, and partner and send people here for short-term courses or whatever, and sort of have the pedagogical experience. And there are traditional Native communities and other places that people might have relationships with that would do that. But you sort of, it's kind of like the main joke, right? The guy who's lost and he goes up to the guy in Maine and he says, "How do I get to such and such a place?" And he says, "You can't get there from here." So I'm not sure if an institution can get there. I think perhaps the best they can do is to, because the tendency of the Western institution is to think that it's about this. And it's more about this whole thing, right? It's about being in the communication. It's about being with Indigenous people. It's about sitting around the fire, and it's about going into ceremony and those kinds of things. that actually create the kinds of experiences that change one's worldview. So, yeah, I'm not going to say that it's without hope, but in the article, I'll lay out some sort of pathways and important things, but it's going to be very difficult, especially if Indigenous people are not in charge.
Well said, however, challenging the response, understood, and a deep challenge to pursue. Dr. Woodley, let me ask if you have any, as we just have a few minutes left, if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close.
Yeah, I think for Christians who can't get there through sort of the indigenous path, they can pick up this whole sort of Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct and sort of get to somewhere different. I'm not saying that Indigenous people have the answers for everyone. I'm just saying that, our people have sort of worked this out on this land, on Turtle Island, over, millennial, from time immemorial. And that's one path. There may be other paths for people from different places and things like that. But this is one path. The point is that we need to get there. We have a very short time to get there. And so whatever it takes, a revitalization of the Shalom, which I've seen in the last sort of like 5 years, my book, Shalom in the Community of Creation, an Indigenous vision has sort of got a life of its own again, a second life. And I've seen more and more titles of books, and I haven't read them all, of course, but I'm hoping that they're on track with what I would call Walter Brueggem's sort of Shalom meta-narrative. And maybe Christian theology can get there through that means if they can't get there through Indigenous means. So.
Well, let me thank you again, not just for your guidance, your wisdom, your teaching with us today, but for your work over the last several decades, the work of your life, the work of expressed in your books, in your teaching, your scholarship, your organizing, the inspiring work that you're doing with your wife at this new center and the vision that it casts. Many, many sincere thanks. Also appreciation today to Dr. Kate Ott and the Stead Center, to my friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie Perdue. Many thanks to all of you who joined us today or who may view the webinar at a later time. Please do look for Dr. Woodley's article that will be shared on the Stead Center page in time. Know that this webinar, which we have recorded, will be posted on Garrett's Indigenous Study Committee webpage where you can view it later. I hope you will share it with others in congregational settings, community groups, seminary classes, and more. And again, we hope you will join us for the upcoming webinars in this series. We're planning on roughly once a month hosting a similar conversation to support the work of the committee. So Dr. Woodley, thank you. To all of the participants, thank you. And blessings to all in the important work of healing and shalom and justice that is yet ahead.